Okay, about 5 seconds, David, and you can just get started.
3, 2, 1. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is David Concannon. I'm a member of the Explorers Club, former chair of the legal committee, and we're going to talk about an exciting topic about how not to die on an expedition, people that have died on expeditions, and what happens when people die on expeditions. It's something that we've been asked to do. I'm joined tonight by David Hoffman and Kristin Larson, two other attorneys that are members of the Explorers Club. For me, my background, I'm a trial attorney. I've been a member of the Explorers Club for nearly 30 years. I've been trying cases for about that long. I plan major expeditions. I represent and advise explorers and organizations in planning expeditions, and I clean up the mess when things go wrong. And I'll turn it over to David Hoffman so he can tell you about himself.
So I used to be a trial lawyer. I'm still a member of the club. I used to be a member of the legal committee. I currently teach bioethics at Columbia University and at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and practice law in the area of clinical ethics consultation, corporate compliance, and hospital law generally. And my part of tonight's program will be to prepare for all of those eventualities. Kristin?
I have been an attorney for about 20 years, and almost the same amount of time I've been either chair, co-chair, or a member of the Explorers Club Legal Committee, bringing primarily expertise in governance, corporate governance, and contract review. Although my primary expertise is in environmental health, safety, risk assessment type activities, where I try to keep large companies out of business, out of trouble, and also to help them through compliance and to reach their objectives. My expertise on tonight's topic is pretty ancillary to my actual practice, but I did help. I don't know if you can. Nope, that's too blurry. You can't see it. It's an expedition medicine and wilderness book that was put out by several members of the club about 10 years ago, I believe. And myself and another woman co-wrote the chapter on legal considerations when planning an expedition. And part of that was touching on some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today.
Thank you very much. I'd like to point out two things. Number one, Kristin is about to receive the Sweeney Medal for her contributions to the Explorers Club. Congratulations, Kristin. It's well deserved. Proud of you. And second, Charles Norchie, who is normally part of our legal panel, is unable to join us tonight because he is in Europe, but he has contributed some slides that I'm going to go through, and his expertise, and was part of the planning for this. I want to reiterate one thing. We're not going to cover the gamut of legal considerations and risk management and expedition planning considerations in an hour. We are only going to give you a tip of the iceberg, and maybe we can do further programming on that, but you can reach out to each of us individually and talk to us. So one of the things that I want to start with, and I'll share my screen, is just the considerations coming from the ethics of the Explorers Club. And let's take a look at this. The club is dedicated to not being able to read things because of Zoom. Okay. The Explorers Club is dedicated to the advancement of field exploration and scientific inquiry. It is the obligation of an explorer. And these are the 5 tenets of ethics of the Explorers Club. 1, 2, 3, 4, attempt to acquire new information, respect environment, local culture, and laws. That's number 3. Collect only necessary items and only with permission, and give full credit to others. But number 5 is plan expeditions properly and avoid unjustified risks. And this is the obligation of every member of this organization. And it's something that we see done very, very well. And unfortunately, some of us see it not done well. So I want to talk about that a little bit. Next slide. Sorry, folks, I'm having trouble with, there we are. Expedition planning involves who? Like the scientific society, is it a university? Is it a corporation? Is it a social group? Is it a commercial operation that leads expeditions? Why? Are you going for the discovery of knowledge? Are you going to increase your reputation? Are you going because you have the money to, or you have the ability to do so? Or are you simply going to check something off the list of things you want to do? Where?
David, I just wanted to let you know, I don't think we see your slides.
Really?
Yeah.
Nope, we do. You're all good.
I do.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Where are you going? Land, sea, air, space, outer space. All of these things have risks associated with them, and you have to take these into account. I'll get into that in a moment. What are you doing? Trekking, climbing, diving, flying, sailing, collecting, sampling, spelunking, sailing into space. What is it? Every single thing that you do, you have to consider the law with the expedition goals in mind. And that is national regulations, permits, for example, international law, jurisdiction, contracts. You have to worry about insurance, export, import, if you're bringing things in and out of a certain country, maritime considerations. You could be on the high seas where, frankly, no country's laws apply. There might be some treaties, there might be some guidelines, but generally speaking, you're out in no man's land. Same thing goes with space. And to a lesser extent, Antarctica. Kristin will touch on that. Intellectual property is a big one. You're collecting imagery. A lot of expeditions are paid for through the licensing and sale of intellectual property. You could be collecting intellectual property for sponsors, for streaming, for some sort of distribution, for books, for television. You have to be mindful of the intellectual property rights that you are going to acquire and what you're going to do with them. Criminal law. Some places you're not allowed to go that you may want to go. And then customary international law. You have to plan for noncompliance. This enhances risks, fines, delays, arrest, litigation, being stopped in customs, having your camera equipment stopped in customs, having your other colleagues stopped in customs. Conditions, these evolve, weather, war, politics, pandemics, things that have to be taken into consideration when you're thinking around corners, when you're planning an expedition. And you have to prepare for the worst: death, loss, directives, advanced care directives, which is something David's going to talk about, repatriation of remains, non-repatriation of remains. And you have to prepare yourself and your family members and your expedition participants for this. I get asked all the time, what is my duty of care? Not often in that language, but meaning, what am I supposed to do in the event of an accident, or what am I supposed to do to make sure that accidents don't occur? And the reality is, the duty of care is set by the law or some sort of organizational requirements or an industry standard. But the default standard in most jurisdictions around the world is a reasonable care under the circumstances. And what that means is that expedition organizers have a duty of care to plan their expedition using reasonable care under the circumstances. Should underline that, under the circumstances of the expedition. That is, they have a duty to identify the risks involved and to either mitigate those risks, accept those risks, reduce those risks, or transfer those risks. Transferring of risk is the use of a liability waiver or something, moving it or getting insurance. But mitigation is, here are the risks, and we're going to do less of this because that's more risky. We're going to spend less time under the water on this face where an avalanche can come by, and try to get through or climb at night instead of in the day. That's mitigation. Acceptance is, it's risky. I could die. I accept that. And reduction is, you identify those things that are risky, whether it's through the use of equipment or the time of year you go, or factors that may increase the risk, and you reduce the risk where you can. If you end up in court, They look to a few items like whether there's some relationship between the parties, guide and client, instructor and student, university and student, some in loco parentis, in parental care, some relationship where somebody has a duty, a higher duty of care than just two friends going out to climb in Yosemite. And so that is important. Next would be whether the injury that occurred was foreseeable. Did you go out during a high avalanche risk time period? Did you go out in a storm? Did you do things where there was a foreseeable risk of harm? Free climbing, you can look at all these items, and was it a foreseeable risk? If it's a foreseeable risk, you have a duty to mitigate, reduce, accept, etc. Next is these are whether it's fair to impose a duty of care on someone. Were two people involved in the same ice storm on the side of a mountain, such that one person was not capable of helping the other person any more than the person that died or was injured was capable of helping their partner? That is whether or not it's fair to impose a duty of care. And then, unless defined by some organizational law, like I said, the default duty is exercising reasonable care. Next is assumption of risk. And we talk about this all the time. We could do a whole hour on this. Exploration is often dangerous and requires explorers to engage in pursuits that often are viewed as extreme. Mountaineering, cave diving, deep diving to the Titanic, they all involve risks, extreme risks. Participants, to assume these risks, must knowingly understand them, they have to appreciate them, and they have to accept them. That is the concept of assumption of risk. The key to assuming a risk is knowing the risk before you encounter it, so that you can understand and accept it when it occurs later. And that is critical in expedition planning. You have to ensure that the participants in your expedition know that they're actually going someplace where they could be injured or die, and this under circumstances that could easily get out of your control. The law speaks of risks in degrees and likelihoods. For many expeditions, both the likelihood of an accident and the degree of harm likely to arise from an accident are exceedingly high. Most of what we engage in the Explorers Club has a risk of serious injury or death. That is part of what we do. And that's just the fact. So if a person is going to participate, I've had people tell me, I didn't know that I was going to be in the jungles in Belize when they signed up to shoot a film about jaguars in the jungle in Belize. That's a true story. And hindsight is 20/20. People are often talking about what they didn't know in hindsight. Try to avoid that when you're planning your expedition. Make sure they know everything with foresight. And if they don't want to go, they don't have to go. But I err on the side of telling them more rather than telling them less. There's a sociologist named Charles Perrow who's got an interesting philosophy. He coined the term normal accidents. Normal accidents refer to unavoidable accidents that occur in the use of high-risk technologies. Think about this with some of the equipment we use. In systems that are tightly coupled and complex, the classic example of being nuclear reactors, but also expeditions, deep diving submersibles, spacecraft, aircraft in extreme locations. Perrow argues that preventing accidents is essentially impossible, and I agree. The only question is when an accident will occur and how large it will be. Counterintuitively, Perrow talks about that increasing safety measures and procedures actually increases the chance that accidents will occur by increasing the complexity of the system. It also will increase the level of comfort of the members of the expedition such that they are off their guard. Increasing safety measures often leads to increased risk-taking behaviors, and that's a phenomenon known as risk homeostasis. We'll come back to this later on. This is the case of Linnea Mills. This is something I want to talk about. This is a worst-case scenario. Here's a photograph of Linnea Mills taken approximately 12 minutes before she died. And this is the perfect example of everything that can go wrong will go wrong, mostly because of poor planning. So with that, David, take it away.
Thank you, David. So I am wearing my ethics hat tonight, and I'm going to talk to you about the nature of the relationship between expedition participants with an eye toward what we can do to make sure that everyone going into a dangerous circumstance knows what they're getting themselves into. So tonight's talk, my part of tonight's talk was born of a conversation I had with Ann Passer, and Ann said to me, David, you should really be telling our club members about what they can, meaning they're physically able to, and what they ought normatively, ethically, to be obligated to do in preparation for any sort of adventure activity, especially the kinds of expeditions that Explorers Club's members get involved in. Now, this is my second of these ethics talks. Ted Janulis and I did one last year, the ethics of exploration, from Dudley and Stevens to Jost Kobush. He's the fellow who climbed most of the way up Everest all by himself. Interesting undertaking. And so if you're interested in sort of the background and the context, that program is available on the club's website. Let me cover some legal stuff before I get into the ethics, because I'm a lawyer. So first, let me say that none of us has any conflicts of interest. That is, we don't have a financial interest in any of the opinions that we're offering. And at the same time, the opinions that all of us are offering are only ours, and they don't represent the positions of our respective employers, sponsors, and certainly not the Explorers Club itself. Next, let me say that it is not our purpose to define a code of ethics for exploration based on the material we're presenting tonight. The club has a code of ethics. I think it could use some work, but we're not going to do this work tonight. So these are ideas that I am sharing from my perspective as an adventurer and as a clinical ethicist and as someone who teaches clinical ethics. So take that for what it's worth. And finally, this is only the start of a conversation about exploration ethics. And really, this should be part of the planning for any expedition. And I think all three of us, David, myself, and Kristin, would be happy to consult with you about how to go about putting together a ethically sound and legally defensible plan for an expedition. So we need to talk about the ethical aspects of the planning, the expedition, and of course the crisis management, which is what happens when things do go wrong, even when you tried to plan for them, because as David said, you have to assume that that is at least likely to be the case at some point, right? If you try to walk blindfolded across the highway once, you'll probably make it. If you try to do it 100 times, no chance, right? Somewhere in the middle, you're going to get flattened by a truck. And we all have an obligation to go into our exploration with that reality in mind. In the program that Ted and I did last year, we talked about the case of Regina versus Dudley and Stevens. That is the cannibalism in the lifeboat case. It is a cautionary tale on so many different levels. And I'm going to talk about Dudley and Stevens in the context of what is a good social contract, what is a good understanding between participants in any high-risk activity outside the built world, outside of access to resources and time to react to situations when you're truly on your own. All of this is the notion in philosophy of a social contract. And the social contract need not be in writing, but it does need to be clearly understood, because all sorts of things happen in people's minds when you get out into the field, and we are not necessarily the same people midway through an expedition that we were on dry land or at low elevation or away from the desert. And so the ship of Theseus is a useful illustration for understanding how people change, even though they look like the same people who started the trip. We're going to talk some about the duty to rescue, and this is an important ethical concept. There is not, for the most part, an enforceable statutory duty to rescue in the law of any nation. The reason is no one has been able to define what is the appropriate amount of risk that a rescuer should be legally obligated to take. And yet, there can be circumstances where legal liability arises simply because you did not act, as David said, as a reasonable person under a given circumstance. And so I think most about these issues in the context of going underwater, because it is truly a foreign land in every respect. And so think about these issues, and Ted and I talked about this some in the prior program, in the context of entrapment. What is the moral duty to rescue a fellow diver who's entrapped? And what ought we to do about a diver who's suffering from nitrogen narcosis, where you are truly not yourself? More on that later. So some quick definitions. Ethics, well, very simple. They're the rules of behavior, principally human behavior, that sit somewhere between enforceable laws and customs and habits. And so we ought to think about ethics in those terms. Exploration, it's simple. It's adventure, to be sure, but with some larger purpose. And that's significant because when you have a larger purpose, there is a greater justification for taking well-reasoned and well-controlled risks. So Dudley and Stevens, you should know, went out on a sail as crew. Ship sank. They wound up in that lifeboat, 3 of them. The youngest member of their lifeboat crew was very near death. They were not far behind, and they made a benefits and burdens decision to accelerate his passing so that his flesh could sustain them. Turned out they were rescued very shortly after they made that fateful decision. But of course, that decision was made without the consent or even the input of the younger member of their lifeboat community. And that's what got them into legal trouble. They were convicted of murder and sentenced to death. And that sentence was later vacated by the Queen. That's a separate legal dimension of Regina versus Dudley and Stevens. But this case makes the point that good planning can prevent all sorts of both moral and legal complications. So what should we as explorers do in preparation for any sort of voyage outside the built world into the field? Well, we have to recognize that we're fundamentally changing the rules that society thinks are adequate to guide ethical behavior, because those rules were built to address circumstances that arise in the built world, in what some people refer to as civilization. I think we could argue about that term. And this is not the first time that we as explorers have traveled this road. We're going to get to that in just a couple of minutes. So in the social contract, all of us as explorers should think about, discuss, and draft some sort of an advance directive that addresses what you want done and what you don't want done, what risks you want your expedition mates to take and what risks you specifically don't want them to take, so that everyone is going into the enterprise with a clear understanding of what is expected of them if they are the injured party at risk of death and what is expected of them if they are not. This has a big element of a very complicated ethical task, which is assessing decisional capacity of the people in your expedition when circumstances are not what anyone expected. And so here, think of a scuba diver and nitrogen narcosis, or somebody in the desert suffering from dehydration, or somebody in the mountains suffering from altitude sickness, right? These are all circumstances where we become, at least from an ethical perspective, fundamentally different people. It is when we become different people that this notion of a duty to rescue can be very important as a way of framing the moral obligations that people have. And this is part of what needs to be discussed in the planning stages of exploration and considered as you move through both the planned and the unplanned events in an expedition or any sort of adventure activity. I have a rule, by the way, about adventure activity. I don't do anything that doesn't have a backup system and doesn't provide time to respond. So I don't do bungee jumping, and that's about it. I'll jump out of a plane as long as I have a second parachute. I will go diving as long as I have a buddy who I trust. I will climb waterfalls as long as I know that the rope has been well cared for. And these are all parts of the moral responsibility of expedition members before they head out into the field. What is an advance directive? So if you don't know, apart from the subject of tonight's talk, you should find out, because everyone in the world, explorer or not, should have an advance directive that addresses their medical and other care wishes in a controlled non-field environment. And these can go by names like living wills or healthcare powers of attorney or healthcare proxies. Doesn't matter what they're called in different jurisdictions. They're all ways of putting down on paper what you want done, what you don't want done, and who you want making decisions in applying your instructions to circumstances that maybe were not contemplated. Important in the built world, more important in the field. So advanced directives exist to deal with circumstances that, frankly, people who don't go on expeditions can't even contemplate. And it's important to recognize that. So if you don't have an advanced directive, you can go to the Compassion and Choices webpage. This is an organization that deals with end-of-life issues, compassionandchoices.org. Our issues, advanced care planning. Call me if you want me to send that link out to you. And they have forms for advanced directives in every imaginable jurisdiction. And they are a place to start this conversation with yourself and with your family. But then you have to write something. So here's my advanced directive for life in the built world. When I'm walking around New York or even out on Shelter Island, even if I'm out in my kayak, where I know that there is rescue readily at hand and what I want done and not done if I am in a state of extremis can be fairly easily and safely followed. So my advanced directive, which is part of my healthcare proxy designating my wife and my kids as my healthcare agents, says this: I do not want to be a potted plant. If I am unable to express myself and show signs of experiencing joy, I want all but pain care withheld so that my passing can come quickly. Organs to the living, body to science, then to the sea. Final instructions to my loved ones: smile and breathe. I have tweaked and played with this advanced directive for decades. We pick it apart every semester in my law and bioethics class at Columbia. And in a controlled, medically supported environment, I think it does the job for me. In the field, this is meaningless. So what is a field advanced directive? Well, it is something altogether different. Let's think about Dudley and Stevens. If when they were planning to serve as crew on that sailboat, they had a conversation about, what are our expectations and what are our prerogatives if we fall out of the controlled circumstance of a sailboat well supplied and well equipped, operating in its normal manner, and we wind up in a lifeboat. Who should be able to make surrogate decisions for an individual who is no longer able to articulate their treatment preferences or their care preferences? In an expedition environment, it is worthless to have someone who is not on the expedition designated as your surrogate, because they're not going to be in a position to make any decisions that matter. And they may think that they have some authority over what expedition members do. If, for example, a sat phone call goes out that somebody's taken a fall and has had a traumatic brain injury, your healthcare surrogate back home can't give meaningful instruction in that environment. And frankly, they shouldn't be allowed to. So then the question is, who should you designate among your expedition partners? And should you designate more than one person? Absolutely, right? Because we have to contemplate that it could be the person you picked as your surrogate who winds up getting out of commission first. But don't designate multiple healthcare agents or healthcare proxies to share responsibility. There's a reason why the captain's word is law. It's not that the captain of a ship is always right. It's that somebody has to have the authority and the responsibility to make decisions when time is short and information is sketchy at best. What should a field advance directive say? Well, it should address who should make decisions about rescue and the risk of rescue if you are injured and not able to speak for yourself, either because you can't speak or because you can't make any sense or don't understand the circumstance that you're encountering, that you may be asking your expedition mates to get you out of. You should say something about available measures and which should be employed if evacuation is not possible. So, for example, an understanding about what would happen to people who wind up in a lifeboat when water's run out and food is gone is something to consider. I wouldn't suggest that you contemplate cannibalism in your advance directive, but I'm not going to tell you not to. Be sure to address what we call in medical ethics the double effect scenario, where you might want somebody to take a step to provide you with relief from your pain, your suffering from a traumatic injury that might accelerate your death, but where the intention is only to relieve the pain. That can be an important both moral and legal protection for anyone who intervenes with morphine or fentanyl. What about consent to field surgery? We're going to talk about that in a moment. Who ought to be allowed to? What should you understand about the qualifications of both the designated expedition medic and what if the medic isn't available? Who else should be allowed to perform field surgery? Think amputation. Think intracranial hemorrhage. Think the worst, you develop appendicitis in the middle of the Indian Ocean, right? So these are things that every member of an expedition, and especially every leader of an expedition, ought to be sure is talked about. And why does this matter? Well, of course, because of Peter Freuchen, right? Those of us who have spent any time in the club have stared up at his portrait in, we're not supposed to call it the trophy room anymore, the gallery. And Peter Freuchen in his very dignified suit jacket and his peg leg. We don't have to get into the mythic tale of his having dug himself out of predicament, an avalanche with frozen feces. But we do have to consider the part of his story about his having made the decision to remove his own toes, frozen and frostbitten, with a pair of pliers. So the question is, what if he was not able to take off his own toes? Should somebody else have had either the right legally or the obligation morally to engage in that surgical procedure for which the individual might not be well trained? I would suggest to you that ought to be worked out ahead of time so that everyone who does the post hoc analysis, the court proceeding, the inquest, the investigation, has a clear understanding of what everyone on the expedition understood was going to be done and not. Here's my field advanced directive. It's very simple. I tend towards simple in my bioethical law practice. First, ignore my directions if I am not of sound mind. This calls to mind the Ulysses clause. Odysseus wanted to sail past the Sirens without wrecking his ship, so he told his crew, tie me to the mast and ignore anything I say until we've passed the Sirens. Likewise, when an expedition is planned, there should be a discussion of what directions from an expedition member should be followed and honored, and which should be ignored because you're not of sound mind. Second, I want my expedition mates to take only reasonable risks, if any at all, to effect my rescue and evacuation. That's my values and my choice. But if I'm on an expedition with someone who says otherwise, that's a moment for reflection. Third, prioritize the safety of the team over the survival of the injured. That should be a consensus for every expedition. And then finally, that double effect issue, relieve my pain without concern of shortening my life. And finally, leave me where I fall, whether that's the ocean or the desert or a mountain or a cave. That may not be right for everyone. That's my approach after spending countless hours on and under the ocean and climbing mountains and ice flows and everything in between. If you don't like my suggestions, fine, come up with your own. So that's it for me. And now back to David.
We having fun yet? That was good. I have to say this before we go on to Kristin. One of the reasons why lawyers know anything about this subject is because people don't do that. And we have to deal with the aftermath. I do between 12 and 20 fatality investigations every year. And about 90% of them, most of the people involved after the death don't know anything about what the decedent would have wanted, and most of them are just told this was perfectly safe and I'm going to have a great time and you go off and play tennis and I will see you on Sunday. And that's not how things work out.
Let me interject one point I forgot.
Yeah.
If you're interested in learning more from both the good and bad experiences of Peter Freuchen, he is the subject of next week's program on a book about him called Wanderlust, which anyone who wants to learn from other people's bad experiences would be well advised to attend that lecture.
That is a great point, David. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Kristin Larson. Kristin has a tremendous amount of experience in remote environments, and she has her experience is equal to mine, if not more so. Kristin?
Thank you. Thank you for having me along, David and David. I think mostly what I'm going to talk about is going to actually raise questions for the other two Davids, because I think I've kind of chosen to sort of focus mainly on, what happens and the record expeditions on Everest. And there is a lot of, ethical dilemmas that arise. What seems to me the impossibility of being able to actually follow through with, a person's desires in that setting. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but I think these are questions that we would like to discuss among ourselves, and we hope that, anybody in the greater audience will also chime in and let us kind of ponder and pick apart. So, I want to emphasize, that in my experience, planning is everything, of course. And I think, most people in the Explorers Club that go on expeditions, spend a lot of time in the planning phase. I think one area, though, that might get short shrift is sort of the whole development of a statement, whether it has includes a directive, a waiver, discussion about legal rights, who's going to own the intellectual property if there's a discovery, how are you going to control that within the group? Those are just, those are not this topic, but it's the whole idea of not only discussing sort of the framework, the legal framework, guiding the expedition, but also memorializing that in a variety of documents that can become touchstones later on, and importantly, can be used, for informing the family. And I know David Concannon is going to probably touch on this a little bit more, but it doesn't do a lot of good to have a lot of advanced directives or your desires about, how you might address, death or dismemberment, on an expedition, if the family doesn't know anything about the risks and how you've decided you want to address those risks. Because if the phone call they're getting is that, their loved one is dead, or, in extremis, they're going to be freaking out and saying, well, do something. And then all of a sudden you have a whole lot of chaos where you could have had a lot more order if you, had a lot of disclosure and discussion up front. And I'm really keen to understand from both David and David, how ethics and, the duty to rescue, basic morality kind of fits in when you're in a situation, let's say, nearing the top of Everest, and, there's somebody who's obviously very sick, either when you're coming up, or, going up to the top or going down. And, what is your responsibility, towards that person, if it puts you at risk, or if it puts your goal of reaching the top of the mountain at risk. I know this has been discussed, ad nauseum in all different kinds of forums, but, I think that these are sort of topics that, we should continue to think about and address. I think that one thing that is for sure, and I think all of us on this panel and probably everybody in the Explorers Club agrees, is, the best laid plans, will go awry, and there will be circumstances that arise that will require on the ground thinking and emergencies to address. And I think you really don't need to look any further than Mount Everest for lots of evidence of that. Certainly Antarctica, high seas, those kinds of places where the normal framework, as David Hoffman called it, the built world is a long ways away, and you need to sort of address things on a rolling basis. So I just want to talk a little bit about Everest and sort of kind of get you thinking about the kinds of things that can happen. At this point, I read an article that was recently written in the BBC framework, and they estimate that there's probably more than 200 frozen corpses on Everest, and many of those are in plain sight of climbers coming and going up and down the mountain, The BBC went on to sort of indicate that about 50% of those deaths kind of occur suddenly by avalanche or falls. And then there's about 20% that they estimate, occur after some prolonged, difficulties, whether that's, from frostbite, exposure, or altitude sickness. So of that 20%, we know that there's some percentage that were probably in base camp being ministered to by a medic for the expedition, maybe some Good Samaritan medic from next door, or members of the team. There's probably conversations going on with the family and that sort of thing. So, in that sort of circumstance, it's possible that your advanced directive could come into play. However, at that point, people are probably scrambling. It's chaotic. People are concerned and, just, trying to do everything they can to, get you down off the mountain alive. So, this is more a question for, David Hoffman to tell me, it's like let's just give that scenario, and we'll have sort of a round robin after I'm done here. But, given that scenario, how much and how realistic is it that an advanced directive will come into play? And, another question I have really is, what is the ethical responsibility in your view when you are, coming down off the mountain, and if you stop and render aid, you could very well be, taking your own life anyway, you might be killing yourself at the same time. Anyway, so, but let's just talk briefly about, what happens when there is a body. And, there's plenty of circumstances where the body's just going to have to be where it is, whether it's down a crevasse, up on the top of Everest, tossed overboard into the Davy Jones locker. And those are maybe easier situations, but if you can get a body down out of wherever it is, you then have a whole lot of other circumstances that need to be addressed. But before you even talk about moving the body or the evidence, you really should spend a lot of time documenting it, trying to get contemporaneous records from witnesses to describe what happened in their view. And because after the fact, people forget, or they become foggy about the details. And I think for a lot of different purposes, it's important to have a lot of documentation. And in order to even get a death certificate in a lot of places, whether it's the US or overseas, you need to be able to document exactly what happened before a death certificate will even be issued. And I think, anyone who's dealt with, the death of a loved one, the death certificate becomes like a very, very important document. So there was one example of a woman, I think this is totally the exception, for a repatriation off of Everest. In the late 1990s, a woman from Telluride wanted to become the first female to summit Everest without oxygen. And she had a young son, and they decided, together that this was something that she had to do. She made the summit, but on the way down, she lapsed and ultimately could not make it. Several people on the mountain tried to render aid, but ultimately she was in the death zone and they needed to move on. So for 10 years, she was in frozen repose on the mountain, for many to see, and she became known as the Sleeping Beauty. I read an account about how her son would periodically, accidentally come across pictures of her, on the internet. And, of course, it would be shocking and very distressful for that to happen. But there's, no kind of advanced directive, no kind of planning could have really changed that. In her situation, there was enough, I think, I guess, distress and care about this situation that two of the people that had rendered aid to her 10 years later went back up at the cost of over $70,000 and went back into the death zone and after 2 tries, located her corpse and bundled her up, gave her last rites, and, tossed her over the edge so that she, would be removed from the public sight. But that's, that by itself is not really repatriation, but at least it's some form of closure. But, it's certainly not the sort of thing that most people can hope that will happen, because at $70,000, it's like that was just one of, many hundreds of bodies that are up there. So I don't really mean to be too macabre, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that, it seems to me that you can have a lot of, plans, you can have a lot of documents, but there are certainly a lot of different types of expeditions in sort of extreme places where those documents, it seems to me, will not be very helpful. In fact, they could give the family members sort of an expectation that can't be met by the expedition. So I'd love David and David to talk about that. So we getting witness statements and that sort of thing. And I guess I'll close just by saying, if you are in a foreign country and you do have a body, the remains of somebody, the Department of State, the local consulate will aid you in clearing customs and obtaining a death certificate, which often can be very, very difficult and extremely emotionally fraught exercise. So I think as part of a planning of an expedition is knowing who you might contact, in the horrible situation if you're trying to get a body home. So I guess I will leave it at that on that happy note and turn it back over to David Concannon.
Thanks, Kristin. Excellent, both of you. So we're just a time check. We're about 10 minutes in, or 50 minutes into the hour. We'll respond to some of those topics and then we'll open it up to questions. I won't go back to Linnea Mills. You can Google it or reach out to me. But on the point of advanced directives, as somebody who's led expeditions, I would appreciate having advanced directives from the expedition participants. And I would do my best to honor them under the circumstances. I would use reasonable care under the circumstances. They are not written in stone. They are not gospel. And, I tend to do things where you go underwater. The last ship I was on for the last 2 years actually has a mortuary on it for the storage of dead bodies, which I found enlightening. But it's the kind of thing where, there's an expectation that somebody's going to die and they have a space set aside on the vessel to store those bodies. In those instances, the body recovery might be possible. In other instances, it's just not possible. I am often called from the scene of a fatality and asked what to do now, and to provide legal advice to the participants about what to do now. I've been called when people are missing, and I've actually worked searches and been responsible for searches because communications between shore and sea are difficult. So I've just taken that over. It's an interesting situation where I think that the people on the expedition have a duty to themselves first. And if you've done everything you can possibly do to mitigate, reduce, accept, or transfer the risk, then if somebody dies, that's par for the course. And if you can recover the body safely, do so. There was an avalanche last weekend in Leavenworth, Washington, just south of Leavenworth, Washington, where 4 of the climbers died. And the authorities didn't go to the scene for 2 days because the risk to the rescuers was too great compared to the odds of finding anyone alive. And that's just standard operating procedures. So, there was no obligation. One of the survivors walked out to get help, and then somebody who had not been with them went and alerted the authorities. So, is somebody going to be unhappy about that? I'm certain. Are they going to have a legal claim? I'm equally certain they won't. But these are the types of things that it just helps thinking in advance. And the other thing about advanced directives is even though you will do our best on an expedition to honor them, what it does for me as the expedition leader is it helps me know that you appreciate and understand the risks of what you're about to do.
It sets expectations for everyone, for sure.
Yes. And there's two types of people on an expedition, those that contribute and those that take away. There's nobody in between. You're either contributing or you're taking away. And when you're taking away, somebody like me or somebody else on my team that's trustworthy and decent has to do your job too. I don't like that. So if you're contributing before you ever get out into the field by thinking in advance about your own safety and what you want done, chances are you're also packing the appropriate equipment and that you're prepared, you're bringing your pharmaceuticals that you have prescribed, you've talked to the expedition medicine or anybody involved and told them, listen, I have a heart condition or I have an ingrown toenail that might get worse and require surgery at sea. It happens, I'm told. And that it's that kind of thing where you just being somebody who puts in instead of being somebody who takes away. My 2 cents.
Absolutely. And, to Kristin's question, which was absolutely the right question, what should be in an advanced directive for the field? It should be instructions about how to make choices between available options, right? An advanced directive for the field ought not to be a Pollyannic notion of what kind of care you expect from your expedition mates, because that may be of less value than my advanced directive for when I'm back home surrounded by hospitals on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. So I think they are important as a tool for communication. Preston Sowell raised some really important points in the chat about everyone knowing what everyone else's advanced directive says, and could an expedition have a uniform advanced directive that defines expectations and responsibilities equally among expedition members? The short answer, Preston, is yes. That is part of the social contract that is the informal, unexamined decision to go out in the field with someone. Don't do that. Or the formal, examined and discussed and documented set of agreements about what will be done in balancing risks and benefits as between the injured and the caregiver. And so I like to think about sort of the classic worst case medically where it would actually matter, a subdural hematoma, right? I have seen lots of burr hole procedures done by neurosurgeons. I could describe doing that in detail. I could probably pull one off in the field if I had to, but I would want to know that my expedition mate wanted me to try that, recognizing that might render the individual suffering from a traumatic brain injury afterwards, versus being left to die and not face the predicament of having a hypoxic or a herniating brain injury. So that's what the conversation ought to be. And Preston raises the additional question of whether the advanced directive might actually help or complicate the grieving process for the family when you bring a body back or you don't bring a body back. And I would say to you, every member of an expedition has an obligation to reach a consensus with the people that they're going out into the field with and to communicate that consensus to their families.
I'll add to that you look, I unfortunately have to study the 5 stages of grief, and I deal with it every day in my law practice. One of the stages of grief is anger. Anger comes before acceptance. Every person that experiences a loss is going to go through those 5 stages, and they don't do it in a linear fashion, and they don't do it any particular time, but anger is definitely one of them. So if you're in the field and you have an advanced directive, it just helps the people who are there with you. If I know that David doesn't want to be, if he wants to be left where he is, I'm not going to put other people at risk and go through these yeoman efforts to try to recover the body in a hellacious storm in Antarctica. And it just means you hunker down and you do what you can to survive. I can give, Tim Keyes asked for examples of case studies where pre-trip risk assessments, field directives would have helped, could have been better, et cetera. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about Linnea Mills, but we haven't run out of time. We're going to continue talking as long as there are questions. But in the case of Linnea Mills, she was a student in a scuba diving course where the instructor took the students diving in Glacier National Park, where there are glaciers, in the winter at night. It was her 5th dive ever, beyond help, no cell service, with faulty equipment, and put her in a 425-foot deep lake with 44 pounds of lead on her 5'3", 135-pound body, and with predictable results. And these things happen. And I defended that. That was a case I just recently had. I defended the organizer of an expedition to the Andrea Doria, who's probably watching, where a participant died of a fatal case of myocarditis, and they also had meningitis, which is probably not advisable if you're going diving to the Andrea Doria. And some good Samaritans recovered the body. He died as soon as he hit the water, and the medical examiner said he was going to die that day, no matter if he was diving on the Andrea Doria or walking the dog. But it took 3 years of litigation to exonerate the expedition planner in that case. And these are the types of things where a highly experienced, highly trained diver who's going on an expedition to the Andrea Doria should accept the possibility that they might die, especially given the reputation of the Andrea Doria. But also, if you happen to have meningitis, and myocarditis just makes you feel lousy, meningitis is different, maybe you should sit out that day. But these are the types of things that are real life experiences. And I could go on and on and on and on and on about case after case after case after case where people's expectations were not met. Normally, it's not the deceased, because their expectations were probably met. It's the family of the deceased. And again, I do, a dozen to 20 of these investigations every year, and I deal with this. But it's not a hypothetical. With regard to planning an expedition ethically, or recovering a body, or helping somebody in need, in distress, Good Samaritan laws across the United States, at least, and that's a good example, say that you have a duty of care. You don't have to rescue anybody. But once you start to rescue somebody, once you start to offer aid, you have a duty to use reasonable care under the circumstances. You don't use a sledgehammer to, stop their nose from bleeding. But you do, if you have to do some sort of a hematoma, release, you do it. And you do the best you can under the circumstances, knowing that you're a lawyer that teaches at Columbia Law School and not a trauma surgeon. And therefore you're safe. So
UC asks a related question. He's an up-and-coming cave diver. Cave diving is a lot of fun, or spelunking, I guess, dry caves. Anyway, do you engage in that medical procedure, or do you get the patient out with the hope that they'll survive to get better care? And that's exactly the kind of issue that has to be discussed, and decisions have to be documented, because that is a choice between two legitimate competing objectives. But I can tell you, having been a paramedic all through college and law school, those are clinical judgments first and ethical judgments second, because there isn't a hard and fast rule about how urgently somebody's subdural hematoma has to be evacuated. It's based on the clinical exam. But having a discussion about whether somebody would want field surgery or would rather be let to die, given the possible consequences of the surgery being successful, but the patient winding up profoundly disabled, that is an ethics question.
Yeah, and truthfully, I don't know any legitimate explorer that can call themselves that would not do whatever they were able to do to help somebody in need. I know people that call themselves explorers that wouldn't, but there are fewer of those than those that would. I know I would do everything possible to help somebody in need, even if it meant jeopardizing my own safety, because that's just what I feel like is the right thing to do. But there's no legal obligation to do that. But there's also people that, have actually said to me, no body, no case. So I didn't go in. And they made that judgment. No body, no case. So I wouldn't have, but they did. And that's a real life example. So, Kristin, do you have anything to add?
That point is that you need to have those discussions in detail, not gory, but specific ahead of time. And that's part of what good expedition planning is about, just as important as making sure that there are no cracked fittings on your regulator and that your pressure gauge is reading accurately and all of the other things that we do when we go diving, or making sure that you have enough carabiners when you
Right.
decide to climb a frozen waterfall.
I represent a lot of rebreather manufacturers in the diving space, and I've recommended to all of them that they run a Valentine's Day special on oxygen sensors, and literally say, do it for your loved ones, change your oxygen sensors, because inevitably there are fatalities every year for people using oxygen sensors that are past their useful life.
Yeah, about half the people
because-
who use rebreathers are qualified to do so.
I don't know about that, but I do know that most of the fatalities I see recently are people that use oxygen sensors past their usable life. And it's a hard conversation to have with the daughter of the deceased, talking about how meticulous her father was about the equipment, and to say, perhaps, but not in this instance.
Yep.
And I've had those conversations, and they're unpleasant.
Yeah, it's my metaphor about walking blindfolded across the highway. Once, probably 100 times, definitely not.
Kristin, what do you have? Tell us something.
Oh, well, I'm just listening with interest and thinking of, maybe the odd, exception. I mean, where, you have Good Samaritan laws that are pretty well established in the United States. And, for, the gist of which says, if you're rendering aid, like you said, you have to, do it reasonably. But there's also the other part of the Good Sam laws that say, if you are not under contract, you don't have an sort of a legal obligation to provide that aid, and the person dies, or you do something wrong, in general, you will not be held liable for the harm that you might have done, using best efforts to avoid that. But not all countries, have that liability protection. As I recall from previous research, most of the European countries basically flat out say you have a duty to render aid if required. So I'm thinking of scenarios where, there's an advance directive that says, no heroics, I don't want to do anything. And you're you're in extremis in a country that, requires Good Sam. And I know these are like kind of, maybe, the classic law school, question, the test question, but it seems to me that again, so much of this is context specific and fluid, and really, I think, in the end, sort of requires people to use the best possible judgment, advance directive notwithstanding. And maybe that's not exactly a popular view, but I'm just thinking of like real life scenarios that where whoever's rendering aid or trying to assist in an accident, might just say, yeah, that's a nice piece of paper, and throw it over their shoulder and soldier on.
I'll tell you one thing. What I'm seeing in my practice is a movement towards more criminal charges being filed against people for improper planning and improper use of did they just people die and somebody's held responsible. There was a case in Malta where a dive buddy was held criminally responsible for the death of the buddy, and he was convicted of negligent homicide. That conviction was overturned last week, but it's still a scary prospect. I know of another instance where somebody's being charged with negligent homicide in the United States. I know of another instance where somebody really should be, except for the idiots at the National Park Investigative Services Bureau. Let me give them a shout out because you're fucking stupid. And
That's an opinion.
Sorry about the F, but you know, there's situations where this is actually where things are turning, where there's criminal negligence on the part of people who don't take these steps. And there are more and more people that understand what has to be done. It's not just civil liability where an insurance company will pick up on it. It's having some real consequences for people's freedom is at risk.
That's the story of Regina versus Dudley and Stevens.
Exactly. That's right.
So
I'm sorry about the profanity. That was an outburst.
Oh, you know, what's a lawyer, a conversation without a few F-bombs? Come on.
Yeah, I'm not a country club lawyer. Sorry, folks. But I don't see any more questions in the chat that could actually keep us here for any longer. So if given that, my closing remarks, and I'll throw it to David and Kristin as well, are thanks for coming.
Hold on one sec, David. I actually put a few more on YouTube.
Oh, you did? Tell me, Kevin, what do we got? I was going to just say next week is really going to be exciting.
Yeah, I'm dropping them in the chat here for you.
All right.
All
Okay.
right.
Jenny, I'll read them, David.
Yeah, go ahead.
Jenny says, has COVID introduced new elements in terms of the interpretation of what constitutes risky exploration for the organizers and who they should take on in their expeditions? I'll start with that. I have done 35 fatality investigations since COVID started. At least 2 were people with asymptomatic COVID, and they died. I would suggest, not to give legal advice, there's the disclaimer, etc., that people be really honest with their health and their fitness and their suitability to conduct the activities required on the expedition. And personally speaking, I would look at some of the research that's emerging on return to play. That's what it's called, return to play after COVID. COVID we don't understand all of its elements, but I know it wreaks havoc on the lungs. You can hear it in my voice from having 3 bouts with it. But there are really serious implications that we may not be aware of, that we may have been fit to do something 3 years ago that we should not expect that we are fit to do now. That's from a personal responsibility standpoint and an advanced directive standpoint. I do not think a whole lot of the COVID restrictions in various geographic locations. I've traveled all over the world for 3 years. I live in the community that had the highest infection rates in the United States, and we canceled COVID after 2 months, and that was it. But that's just because by decree. But it's the kind of thing where you really ought to consider your fitness and your health and take an honest assessment before you engage in expeditions into extreme environments that require a high degree of physical activity. My 2 cents. David.
I work in a hospital, and so I've seen every aspect of COVID. And what concerns me most in the context of expedition ethics and field preparation is the uncertainty of long COVID and the understanding that needs to exist between expedition members who may be spending extended periods of time in a boat cabin or in a cave or in a tent on the side of a mountain, that you are putting yourselves at risk, and that risk needs to be understood. And part of the social contract that is formed in creating an expedition team has to be a health assessment. And as we get more insights about what health conditions can render someone no longer the helper, but the helpee, the person in need of assistance from the rest of the expedition team, we will be refining those social contracts.
Kristin?
No, I don't think I really have anything to add to that. I think, yeah, I mean, being honest with your expedition mates is very, very important, and you know, being honest about what your capabilities are.
So Darren asks, any recommendations for hostage kidnapping situations while on an expedition or medical mission, for example, or placed into custody unjustly? That we have been absolutely talking about as a future discussion. That's a big topic. There are really good resources for what to do in the circumstance of a kidnapping or a hostage situation. I don't want to punt, but I think it's beyond the scope of this discussion tonight, but there are resources available that you should look at. And if you're going into hostile territory where this is a risk, certainly plan for that. To wrap it into this discussion, perhaps get kidnapping and ransom insurance, and perhaps take steps to not be an appealing target, which I know I've certainly done in parts of the world. Once you're in a kidnapping or a ransom situation, you're really at the mercy of your kidnappers, and you know, hopefully you don't look like me in, you know, with Al Qaeda, but it's a situation that you really have to consider as part of your ethical obligations for the Explorers Club and your duty to your expedition. But I don't want to say more than that with the limited scope of tonight's discussion, but it is a great conversation to be held in the future.
Yeah, the last question we have here from Ali is sort of a related concept. Ali asks, what level of risk would the expedition need to be for these discussions and documents need to be introduced? And the answer is not a satisfying one. You know, we wrestle in bioethics with assessment of pain, and we've come up with the best tool available to differentiate levels of pain, and it's the smiley face scale. It's quite ridiculous, but assessing risk is even harder. I'd rather be tasked with assessing and quantifying somebody's pain than quantifying the risk in an expedition, because they're all different based on who the participants are, where the geography is, what equipment will be available, what is feasible in terms of rescue at whose expense. So I would answer your question, Ali, or Ali, I'm not sure, I can't see very well, that these discussions and these documents are needed in some measure in preparation for every single expedition, because there is always risk and there is always something that ought to be hammered out ahead of time.
Well,
I would add, oh, Kristin, go ahead.
I was just going to, you know, when I read that question, it came to mind that, you know, many Thanksgivings, I car caravan down to a bay in Baja, California. And, you know, it's just a bunch of families, you know, camping out on the beach. But, you know, there's enough going on in parts of Baja. You know, there's kidnappings, there's, you know, carjackings, there's, people disappearing still. And, it's like it kind of really started making me think that, really even something, as sort of innocuous as a 1 week car caravan down to Baja could actually benefit from having these, at least some level of documentation. What do we do? Who do we call if there's a kidnapping? How do we deal with evacuation? So I think, it's really about how remote it is and sort of, check in with the Department of State website and see what's going on in terms of kidnappings and different levels of crime that are hard to address by the State Department.
Yeah, and I'll just add my 2 cents on that is that there's really no minimum level of expedition where these conversations shouldn't be had, because even a day trip, especially where I live, I'm looking out at the Rocky Mountain, the wilderness is 100 feet away and it's snowing. There's no minimum circumstance where we shouldn't be talking with our participants about what to do in the event of an emergency and how to communicate to get help where there's no cell phone service, for example, and what to do if an avalanche occurs, because that's a high risk today. So it's again, remember, it's reasonable under the circumstances. That's the duty of reasonable care, reasonable under the circumstances. So if the circumstances are that it's at the end of February in the Rocky Mountains and it's snowing and there's a high risk of avalanche danger, you have to have the conversations. It's prudent to document having had the conversations.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to create paperwork if you're going out with your neighbor on snowmobiles today, but you really should have that conversation about how to avoid avalanche slide zones and what to do in the event of emergency, because there is no cell phone service, and you should have avalanche beacon and you should have appropriate equipment with you, and you should just give it some thought the night before instead of the morning of. And that's really what it comes down to. Again, if you're a member of the Explorers Club, you have an ethical obligation to properly plan an expedition. If you're in the habit of properly planning a major expedition, you then should be in the habit of properly planning an excursion into the backcountry, an excursion into the wilderness, and being prepared to self-rescue. And it will never be a legal issue if you don't first take care of it from a moral and just a self-preservation issue. You'll never have to talk to a lawyer about it unless you don't. And then, we'll have a conversation. Maybe.
We'll be here.
Yeah, we'll be here. Listen, thanks to everybody that watched. Thanks to David and Kristin and Charles and Ann and Kevin. This was great. This was, we hope your eyes didn't glaze over. We hope you took some information out of this. If you want to see more or you want to know more, you can either contact us individually or put it out there for the club. We've been doing these talks for about 2 years and we enjoy doing them. And, we really are happy to continue. So have a great night. Thanks for sharing this with us, and we'll see you at the club or out in the field.
Stay safe.